I'd like to introduce John Fernandez, who's the professor of architecture here at MIT and director of MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. He's going to guide us through this last discussion, which I think will be really interesting. So, John, thank you. And the other panelists should feel free to come on up as well.
Come on up. Thank you, Tom. First, I also want to echo, the panel can come up, please. You're still here, right? Yeah, there you go. Okay, cool. Also want to echo the many thanks to Tom Kiley for his organization. He did say that we're in the final stretch. There's a certain resonance to that with what we're going to be talking about today. So biological solutions for climate change are often considered in terms of the final stretch. 2040, 2050, after we've done the energy transition, now we need to remove some carbon from the atmosphere. And oh yeah, trees do that. So there's a certain resonance about the kind of afterthought that nature-based solutions are often, that's usually the framing. And I think you heard from Ernie Moniz yesterday that he included biological carbon removal from the atmosphere as essential. We know there's an emissions gap. It's come up over the last couple of days. So we're going to talk about this, and I'm going to identify the panel to begin with. Immediately to my left and to the right here, Derek Lynch, professor, Department of Plant, Food, Environmental Sciences, Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Tana Marie Rogers, Coastal Training Program Coordinator for Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. We've got Mike Snyder, the Commissioner of Vermont Forest, Parks and Recreation, and Nick Rio, so Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies and Native American Studies at Dartmouth College, and they've pushed me to the last chair over there, so I'll join them in a second. So what are we really talking about? We're talking about nature-based systems or solutions for climate change. So nature-based or natural climate solutions, NCS, that's often used as well. We're talking about forests, wetlands, grasslands, agricultural lands. Again, Tom's organization could not have teed up our panel better than with Doran's presentation. Soils, coastal ecosystems, including salt marshes, seagrasses, and the ecosystems and the biodiversity that is supported by those systems. Green carbon is the carbon stored in plants and soil, as just described. Blue carbon is the carbon captured by world's oceans and coastal ecosystems. So natural climate solutions, why are we talking about this today? Well, the natural machine of carbon capture is all around us. And if it didn't mess with the video, I would lift all of these shades to show you, and if it were a clearer day, you can see that carbon capture machine happening today all the time. So it is the cheapest, most scalable technology for removing carbon from the atmosphere. That's an important thing to remember. Partly because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios, all of the scenarios, most of the scenarios are consistent with, that are consistent with limited warming to 2 degrees, include a major carbon removal method. Again, often stated as a latter stage in our efforts, but inexpensive and scalable, something that we should probably be scaling up today, and to address that emissions gap. The strategies, just so that we can all have some basic vocabulary and knowledge before we get into the conversation. Land conversion, deforestation, soil degradation, wetland and peatland loss, all of those release carbon. And the avoidance of further loss is now generally considered to be a major strategy for achieving carbon reduction targets. So the total net emissions from deforestation and land use changes today is about 12%. So that's roughly not quite 5 gigatons of CO2 per year, right? So that's, just to put that in perspective, so 12% is not trivial. And as hopefully the energy transition continues and carbon emissions from powering the electrical grid, transportation, and industry reduces, that percentage is going to increase unless we reduce it as well. So that's the carbon capture element of our discussion, but I now want to lay on two other sets of issues that are absolutely integral. And we have just a fabulous panel to be addressing the complexity of this issue. The first is that effectively implemented, natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions often have really significant and multiple co-benefits. So water, filtration, soil health, biodiversity, agriculture, biodiversity, habitat, protection and expansion, and enhanced climate resilience, buffering from floods and storm surges. That's the first one. So, and I actually don't like that phrase co-benefits because it almost trivializes the idea that those topics are secondary. Biodiversity, that's not secondary. I mean, this is a central priority for our species, in my opinion. The second layer of priorities that I'd like to introduce and the panel will address is that almost all natural climate solutions involve a great deal of social, economic, political, cultural complexity, and really involves a wide-ranging set of issues and stakeholder priorities with those strategies that I mentioned before, and therefore include people. So one half of this discussion is people. People who live there, people who depend on, their jobs depend on natural systems, people who value natural systems and nature generally. So for the past day and a half, we've been talking about more on the technical side of climate solutions. Now we're going to sort of shift to the natural or the non-technical side of climate solutions, although you'll see there's a lot of technology embedded in natural climate solutions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and have, I was going to do it the opposite way, but now the panel has a mind to start with Derek and go to Nick, introduce themselves, and just a short thought on what you do and what's important to you. And then we'll start off on the conversation. Derek?
Want me to move to that end?
No,
Make
no,
it easier?
cool.
Okay.
No, that's cool.
Right. So I've originally from Ireland, but have lived in Canada about 40 years and actually worked in silviculture my first few years in the West planting trees to pay my way through university, but the last 30 years on the East Coast, and most of that in the agricultural sector, private consulting, and the last 20 years working as an agronomist. And I'm always tempted to poll an audience what an agronomist is, but an agronomist working on field crops and cropping systems, not animals, but field crops, and then in soil science as well. And I currently co-lead a major federally funded project to develop an Atlantic soil health lab for the Atlantic provinces. My colleague and myself, our focus of that initiative over the next 5 years is to work across the maritime provinces and to map soil carbon and the soil carbon deficit across agricultural systems, and to look at the resiliency or lack of resiliency of soils in agricultural systems, and to look at the impact of and link that back to farm management practices and the likely impact of those practices off farm as well in terms of nutrient loading, greenhouse gases, and et cetera. My PhD was on soil carbon and nitrogen dynamics in forage or perennial cropping systems in Nova Scotia. And actually the farm I conducted that research on had, typical of many coastal farms in Nova Scotia, had hundreds of acres of reclaimed coastal wetlands going back to the 1600s, dike land or marshland, which is highly valued. It's about 10% of the land base, of the agricultural land base in Nova Scotia is reclaimed marshland and dike land. And it's extremely exposed to climate change, of course. And the history of that is the connection with the population and the culture and the history is quite remarkable. And there's actually embedded in that a history, a connection to Massachusetts that you may be aware of, and New England as well. And some of that landscape has been recently designated as UNESCO World Heritage agricultural landscape. So that's part of the mix of the complexity of making decisions around adaptation and reverting landscapes back to what might be an improved setting of coastal wetlands. I could talk a little bit about data and the technology applied to how can we really use rapidly advanced landscape of data collection to measure soil carbon and to measure greenhouse gases, both from remote sensing and from proximal sensing or on-farm sensing. And that's such a rapidly evolving fields that's the focus of our latest hire of our faculty is just to work on big data management from agricultural landscapes. Remote sensing, whether it's satellite sensing to on-the-go tractor sensors measuring pH, conductivity, soil organic matter, soil carbon, etc. Who owns that data? How publicly shared is it? Can we map carbon deficits on a fine scale? These are really evolving issues around that are issues of policy as much as the technology. In fact, this week, just on that topic of mapping soil carbon globally, you may be aware this week on Tuesday was World Soil Day, and the FAO released a wonderful initiative, the Global Soil Organic Carbon Map. It's fairly coarse resolution, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, but this was a fantastic example of a collaborative venture across all countries in the world to finally put up a map of soil carbon levels. And if you looked at that map, you would notice that 10 countries contain 60% of the world's soil carbon. And of course, the US and Canada are among those 10 and have the greatest opportunity to focus in on their agricultural and land use management to consider sequestering carbon and effectively draw down CO2 levels. How we do that, and in agriculture, how we engage agriculture in that venture is a very long topic, but I'll perhaps come back to that. Thanks very much.
Donna Marie.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, John, for the introduction. My name is Donna Marie Rogers, and I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Woquoit Bay Research Reserve based on Cape Cod in Falmouth. And in terms of introducing myself, I need to introduce both what the Research Reserve System is, as well as the Coastal Training Program, to give you an idea of the kind of work that I do. And so the Woquoit Bay Reserve is actually a part of a network of 29 protected places around the country, referred to as the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And these places are set apart to basically facilitate research on coastal and estuarine ecosystems, monitor their change over time, so be places that you can have that long-term record of change, what's happening in these environments, be places that actually work with the community at large and other organizations to steward these places in a way that we are taking care of them in the best possible way and acting with making land use decisions that are wise and that are smart for the coastal environment, and then also feeding back the science that's being done in these places that's facilitated by the reserve system, and that's done by a host of different researchers, not just those associated with the reserve system themselves, to feed that science back out into the community to actually have that science have an impact on decisions, management, and policy. And so that latter part is where I work. About 15 years ago, the reserve system realized that we couldn't depend on science-based decisions happening just ad hoc or by chance, that we needed to have a way to be able to facilitate that transfer of knowledge, that transfer of information in a way that we were routinely integrating the decision makers that we wanted to reach with that science into the conversation. And so they created a program called the Coastal Training Program, which you will find one in all these 29 reserves that are in coastal states around the country. And so that's the program that I coordinate. Here in Massachusetts, and germane to this conversation today, is research that we're doing on blue carbon systems, on coastal wetlands, and the role that they play in storing carbon, primarily in the soils, for decades, for hundreds of years, and locking up that carbon and preventing that from contributing to the climate change problem. So we are working with a team of researchers in a project called the Bringing Wetlands to Market Project, which has evolved into a number of different pieces, really understanding greenhouse gas dynamics in coastal wetlands, what factors affect the storage of carbon, and also looking at other factors that might cause that carbon to be released, which we don't want to happen, back into the atmosphere, and therefore transforming these places from being carbon sinks to carbon sources. So we're trying to better understand that, and also use that science to develop some modeling tools and some other tools that can help actually for coastal wetlands for the first time to be considered as part of carbon markets. And so we're working at that interface of really seeing how we can both understand the carbon storage processes, develop tools that can help managers really work in terms of using that science, and also understanding how we can maybe bring that innovative element into the carbon wetlands as a carbon financing for coastal wetlands. And so my role in that work is really looking again at bridging the research and the management and the policy decisions. In our previous panel, there was a lot of conversation about how do the stakeholder processes, how do you integrate stakeholders in that conversation? And in this blue carbon world that we're in right now in research, it's a very exciting topic because blue carbon is new on the scene in terms of people's understanding of how coastal wetlands actually an ecosystem role in storing carbon. That's brand new for many resource managers and policymakers to wrap their heads around. And so how do we move from both building awareness on that topic to having people actually make decisions and policies that are cognizant of that science? So that's where my mind is centered on in terms of, as we're talking about climate action, is how do we actually get resource management and natural systems, in particular coastal wetlands, a part of that conversation.
Great. Mike.
Good morning. My name's Mike Snyder, and I am delighted to be here. In fact, it was a real hoot to message back to my family that I finally got into MIT. I am happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Commissioner of Vermont's Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I think the way I would like to introduce myself by way of background for this setting and context is I'm a forester, a licensed forester in Vermont, over 3 decades experience working in forestry. A significant part of that time in forest science, particularly studying how forests function, a theme I would like to return to as we discuss things, particularly biogeochemistry, elemental cycling in forest systems, and how those systems are altered by and respond to human perturbation. An equal portion of my career has been spent in forest management, delivering technical assistance to landowners, trying to bring that technology transfer from the world of science to management, implementing it. And then for the last 7 years, I have worked as commissioner, appointed by now 2 separate governors, with a statutory role to help implement forest policy in the state and to oversee the state park system and outdoor recreation in the state, which are our mechanisms for engaging the actual people involved and helping foster deeper connections with the natural world. I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas of what we're working on in a suite, an array of activities related to climate, among many other things, climate adaptation and mitigation in Vermont. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Rio. I'm a faculty member at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. I've got a joint appointment in Native American Studies and Environmental Studies. And one of the topics that I teach about and that I study is Indigenous peoples' experiences with rapid environmental change. One of the things that characterizes existing research and just sort of public awareness about Indigenous experiences with climate change and other forms of rapid environmental change, like those that unfold with the presence of invasive species and rapid land use change. One of the main themes that you see is indigenous peoples as sort of passive victims of these changes. So that we see more of like a vulnerability discourse within the literature in this topic. So one of the things I do is sort of push back against that a little bit and try to document the ways that indigenous groups are very actively responding to and thinking about these changes that they're a part of and that they're influencing and counteracting or responding to or contributing to, and try to show that there's a lot of diversity across groups and within groups. So that's one of the themes of my work. It's just thinking about those experiences within indigenous contexts. And there's a couple of reasons why I find that to be an interesting and important topic. One is I'm myself an indigenous person, so I'm a member of an Anishinaabe tribe, a tribal nation located in northern Michigan, so in the Great Lakes region. And so this topic gives me a chance to work with my own community and neighboring communities on issues that are self-identified within these communities as important. So I feel like I can contribute to something within my community and neighboring communities. I also find it really interesting and important because all the indigenous communities that I've worked with, and I think there's no universalities. I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but in general, people are aware that indigenous groups, as sort of by definition, have long occupancy in particular geographies. And so with that, I think most of us recognize comes observational knowledge over time, right? So potentially thousands of years of observational knowledge of changes and continuity and patterns. I think that's on a lot of people's consciousness and awareness. But what I find important is that it's not just occupancy and observation, but there's a dynamic interchange within a particular geography between groups of people and their understanding of the dynamics of that place. So, the dynamics of plant-animal communities, the dynamics of how society interacts with nature, and the knowledge and observation of changes and patterns over long periods of time. And related to that, many indigenous communities around the world, and all the ones that I've worked with, have a perspective of making decisions, recognizing what's going on in their present reality, making decisions about the future, thinking about long time scales, which is really relevant to the conversations today and yesterday here. It's thinking about long time scales, like having no interest in ever leaving or abandoning an area, being committed to an area, and thinking, many generations in the future with decision making about complex land use decisions and that sort of thing. So thinking long time scales in the future, but also in the past. So in making decisions about the present, really reflecting on experiences and understandings that come from the past, and then thinking long distances into the future to try to leave, and it sounds a little cliche, but to really try to leave your home place in a better condition for future generations. And so I find that to be an important context for engaging in broader discussions about climate change and other forms of environmental change.
Great. Thank you all. So clearly, there is a huge range of topics here. I have 13 key questions here, which will probably take a good day and a half. And the conversations we've had by email, really seems to me are going to lead to another 2-day summit on nature-based solutions. So I'm going to try to focus this on a couple of key questions. So Tana Marie and then Mike, same question. Let's be frank. The natural systems and the appetite for protection and conservation, this is all under siege today. I'm really interested in the brass tacks on, the reality on the ground of how do you align different and sometimes divergent stakeholder interests for the goal of protection, conservation, management. That's the main question. The foundation of that is we all know, we've heard the past day and a half, that international agreements and national commitments really are they only hold, water, they're only real by way of thousands of local decisions. So, Tana Marie, if you'd like to address that first, that'd be great.
Thank you, because I was wondering how I was going to make an entry into the kind of local decisions aspect of this. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm working at that interface of really trying to not just use the term bridge science to management, but actually work with the people who make day-to-day decisions about that. And in the New England context where we are, that's pretty messy because you have, even just at local government level, you have those folks that are elected and appointed officials. They have a role. You have the staff that work at the local level. You have civic volunteers who work on many different boards that make decisions. So in one particular town, you will have hundreds of people that are working on a conservation commission, a planning board, a zoning board, a natural resources board, a beach management committee, a wetlands committee, a water quality committee, and these are not paid staff. These are the forces of our community wanting to contribute to their community. They may not even have a scientific understanding of the systems that they work to protect, but they have an interest in doing that. And that gives you an idea of the complexity and range of stakeholders that you have to bring in a conversation when you say you want to actually move people from both understanding these issues, understanding the science, and then go to the next step of integrating it in decision making. And then when we expand that out to the community at large, when we're talking with the community-based organizations, the nonprofits, the interested members of the public, and the uninterested members of the public to work with that. So to make this much more concrete, when we, in 2011 at the Reserve, that is a place in the community on Cape Cod, set up to do research on natural systems. We, as the national network, said, we want to do more on climate change issues, both understanding how these places are going to be affected by climate change and what we can do in terms of preparing, mitigation, and adaptation, and building resilience. And so we started out with this exploration of what would happen to our coastal wetland environments. And through that conversation and working with scientists working on coastal wetlands was born this project about investigating blue carbon. Now, I tell you that story to say that even though we were in that community as a place, a research facility, we ourselves were not cognizant of blue carbon as a resource that's helping to mitigate climate impacts. And as we learned that, we kind of jumped on that and decided to enter into this project that I mentioned, the Bringing Wetlands to Market project, using a different research paradigm, which was to not have the classic researchers go out and just study the science and bring it and deliver it to the manager and say, well, here you go. Which part of this would you like to use? We decided to approach this project, what we call collaborative science. So really bring in the decision makers, the potential end users of the science early on in the project so that they could help us really direct and understand what they wanted to know, what they needed to know, and what these tools were that we could produce that would help them actually make decisions that were much more informed than before. Now, I go through that to tell you that when you talk about bringing the brass tacks to stakeholder engagement and really having them understand, one of the first things is really understanding that stakeholders bring their own wealth of expertise, their own kind of diverse set of knowledge, and they're not just recipients of knowledge. So we first have to change the mindset that they're just kind of there to receive something from the experts. But the mindset change is that they themselves have expertise in something else. It might be in finance, it might be in community engagement, it might be knowing the historical changes that have taken place in that particular locale, but they have a wealth of knowledge. And I think changing the dynamics about that interplay, that you're not just there to receive, but to give, and to actually talk about what you value about your community, what you would like to see, and whether or not this science would be actually impactful to the work you're doing in the way that we're thinking about it. And I think that that was a fundamental change in terms of really coming to our stakeholders. They themselves were surprised that you want us to be at the front end. So the front end engagement of stakeholders, I think, is critical. Two, you mentioned it, John, about realizing different interests and needs. And so somebody working up at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts that's putting together the Climate Action Plan and the greenhouse gas goals would need a different level of information than somebody at the local level that's on a conservation commission that's making decisions about what they permit in a local wetland or not. Each of those decisions connect, but they're at different scales. And so we have to figure out how to kind of match those interests and bring information, the science, break it down in a way that those different sets of partners will get what they want out of it. One of the things we also learned was that you actually needed someone. We're talking about reaching people, but you also needed someone that was designated to do that role, to do that bringing together of the stakeholders, to do that translation. And for a long time, that has been kind of recognized as important, but not recognized enough to understand that it needs a strategic approach, a strategic process, something that's structured and facilitated well. Those conversations, those meetings, those needs to build relationships need to not just be left to chance, but also need to have people who are trained to work at that interface of bringing the stakeholders into the process. And then you asked about if the conservation kind of need was under siege. I think our experience has been that actually people really value the natural places they live in. I think the way we talk about them might be a little bit different. I think if we come and say, oh, well, you need to change this because of climate change, or you need to do that to help with carbon, if we start at the place of what they value about the community, we are often surprised that they really do value these natural places for different things. You talked about the co-benefits, which are not really co-benefits, but are just all the different things that these places provide. And I think that, too, is a critical change in mindset, that if we don't think that people necessarily want to harm these places, but we just need to connect with them about what these places are doing. And the blue carbon piece has been an exciting means to be able to expand people's understanding that these places in their backyards are actually contributing to storing carbon. That has been a fundamental change in awareness, but it's a struggle to get people to move to the next place of implementing decisions or making decisions around that.
Well, so the benefit is the value is already there.
Yes.
But just tapping into it
And
enhancing it and supporting it.
Exactly.
Mike?
Well, I would approach it, I guess I'll expose my bias with the more green carbon and forest systems, but basically say almost the same things that Donna Marie has said in blue carbon. Our premise here is quite simple and I think powerful. That is, we want to keep forests and functioning as forests. And going along with that is a recognition of that, thinking of forests more as a verb than a noun, about what they do. They are functional. So forests are enormously complex. At their best, they are marked and characterized by variation and dynamism. Did I mention they're complex? They're really complex, and they're the easy part. It's the people that make things difficult. And as a forester now over 30 years of practicing, I'd say what we do more and more is we manage people's expectations of forests rather than actually managing forests. So the role of forests in the carbon cycle is very well established. through storage and uptake, and it's massive. Forests are also critical in protecting air quality in other ways with respect to pollution and human health, water supply, water quality, flood attenuation, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, connectivity. Forests are, particularly in a place like Vermont, the backdrop and natural infrastructure for a world-class tourism and outdoor recreation economy. And it's a significant part of our state's GDP through $1.5 billion of annual economic output through forest products, wood products principally. So, but it's almost completely ignored and taken completely for granted. So, meeting people where they are and helping, these are these so-called co-benefits and all, it's quite a package, and we like to think that we're forest strong in Vermont. We are really, really lucky, and we're somewhat accidentally that way. 78% forested, 80 to 85% of that is private ownership, mostly family owners, and largely in good shape, providing many of these benefits. I think I'm going to address the question by just sharing a quick story, an anecdote. A year or so ago, I was asked to travel to India to speak at a climate conference on the role of forests in mitigating atmospheric carbon. And I thought, what am I doing here? Vermont, remember, Vermont is basically the opposite of India. It's really small, and there's almost nobody there. and we have a lot of trees. So I'm thinking, this is the height of arrogance. I'm going to go to India and give some suggestions for how to meet their very, very aggressive mitigation goals through COP21. And I was really flummoxed by this, and then decided, well, I'm just going to go with what I got and tell some stories from our perspective, try to be humble and respectful that I'm not saying this can work there, but here's how we approach it, is meeting people where they are and helping from the grassroots community level. This is a very Vermont scale approach to understand first the importance of forests and the role of good forestry in keeping forests. And that's where we start to get into the economics, local economies, particularly in rural places like Vermont, and thinking about new approaches, remembering that forests are both, we understand that they have this great role, the mitigating role, but forests are vulnerable to climate change. Ecologically, which we're already seeing, operationally in terms of our approach to silviculture and management, very strict limitations on our ability to function, and then globalized economic pressures. So going to India and just basically telling our story and thinking that I'd be laughed out of the room, it was amazing because it was so well received by Indian foresters and community organizers, because they said, we don't want to be told. They have many needs. There's 300 million Indians without electricity, nearly the population of our country. They have other bigger pressures, and to say you're going to conserve and you're going to find renewable energy, there was really no appetite for that. But there was appetite in local rural economic development through better land use decisions and believing in the power of forests. They have fuel needs and they have local economic development needs. So I would just share that as a wonderful example of the power of meeting people where they are. It's not a lecture. It's understanding values that matter to people in the real world. I told John earlier that I'm proud to be a forester, and to me what that means is I'm a forest ecologist who practices in the real world with real pressures and tried to do that in a way that's based on sound ecological principles. And I really believe in this, and I think we can be a model for it in tiny little Vermont, and it's wonderful to see that message can be so well received on the other side of the planet.
Thank you. So I have to admit a concern I have with these kinds of conversations, that there's a sense of feeling good about it all. We're talking about trees and
trees are good. Wetlands
and all that. And I just want to remind us that, the hard-edged, Ernie Moniz, realpolitik kind of person that he is, mentions biological systems as essential in carbon removal, and the numbers are there. So I want to ask you a question. Derek, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask Nick this. I'm going to ask you the same question, but different variants of that question. So I'm really interested in, since this is a summit on regional collaboration, the potential for, Derek, what do we need to know more about natural systems? What is the data? Where are the data gaps, information gaps? What are the technologies that one would use? And same question about what is the potential for regional collaboration? Nick, you had mentioned in our correspondence that first peoples as a model, so the practices of Native Americans, First Peoples in Canada, of their approach to land and landscape and ecosystems. Play that out a little bit, because I'm having a hard time understanding how that kind of perspective can be a model for other communities, non-First Peoples and other types of communities. I'm really intrigued by the idea, but I'd like to get some thoughts on that. Derek?
Yeah, well, I'm going to look at the data and the data gaps from sort of global or national scale right down to the farm scale, and what that means to an individual producer, and what the concept even of talking about energy flows in food systems and their contribution to climate change.
But can you make sure to focus on the regional collaborative?
I will.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's enormous opportunities there. It's a complex topic looking at greenhouse gases in food systems. You're not dealing just with carbon and soil carbon, you're dealing with nitrous oxide and methane. But just to keep it simple, if we look at the sort of mapping, rough as it is, of soil carbon trends in eastern Canada, and we're talking Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, the trend is quite negative. The trends in intensity of farming systems has been to become more intensive, and there's lots of reasons for that, and lots of pressures on producers to simplify their cropping system, to go with crops that are low residue, low carbon return to soil, and as a result, we're measuring and monitoring more and more declining soil organic carbon levels. And we can do that on a whole farm scale, we can do that on a regional scale. Agriculture Canada tracks this. The province of PEI actually is very progressive in this regard. 20 years ago, they put in place 300 geo-referenced soil monitoring sites. Every 3 years, they take data off those sites. And they've just published the 2-decade trend in soil organic matter, which is a declining soil organic carbon. So that kind of data is lacking, but we can also talk about the entire food system, and we could look at that regionally. Because if you talk about the entire food system and move away from just soil carbon or particular farms, and you're really interested in the embedded energy going into food systems, plus the farm level production, plus the transport, plus the processing, plus the retail, whether that's on a region or a national level, that data is largely lacking. USDA actually did a national audit of the energy embedded in the entire food system in the US back in 2010, broken down by sector, by transport, by retail. And one can imagine doing that on a regional level. In the conversations yesterday about transport and the percentage of transport as a component of regional greenhouse gas emissions, I kept thinking, I wonder how much of that is food transportation. So it does tend to get segregated agriculture, and we could be thinking only of the farm level when we're talking about regional collaboration, but are we talking about the entire food system when we're talking about regional collaboration to address climate change? Because globally, if you really look from field to fork, by some estimates, food systems are 40 to 50% of the entire greenhouse gas emissions globally. Transportation and embedded energy tends to get separated out. I'll just say There's two things that come to mind. One can think of policy programs and even carbon offset protocols. All three, the complexity of those applied to agriculture and the opportunities for innovation on programs at the provincial and state level to support innovation in agriculture on greenhouse gas emissions, support risk management, support adaptation to climate change. And there's some wonderful examples coming forth, sometimes driven out of necessity in different provinces and states in terms of creative programs through the departments of agriculture. Protocols identifying carbon offset protocols. I was at a meeting about 3 weeks ago of the National Association of Rangeland and Forage Growers and Pasture Growers in Canada, and you're talking about an enormous land base of farms who were really interested to participate in carbon offset mechanisms. And after 2 days of listening to the legalese and the complexity of carbon offsets, it was very sad to see some of those farms basically withdraw almost their interest, because there was no obvious mechanism for these farms that are actually sitting on the largest bank of carbon to currently participate in carbon offset mechanisms. So creative regional initiatives in terms of participating in carbon markets for any land management system would be excellent. And it's sometimes down at the individual sector level is where that's missing. It's not the cap and trade mechanism interjurisdictionally. And then so programs, politics, and policy, but engagement. If we're talking yesterday about customer engagement, well, customer for me is anybody who eats. How do we engage that community regionally in transforming their relationship to food and agriculture and landscapes? Because if we're declining soil carbon in this region and impacting coastal estuaries and nitrogen deposition in forest ecosystems, most people have no appreciation of that's the cost of food. And if we can turn that around to co-benefits, that's really the challenge. So how do we engage consumers in that, and how do we engage farmers? It's daunting talking to farmers about soil carbon storage. It's a boring topic. They would much rather talk about soil health and adaptation and revitalizing their farming systems. But who pays them to do that? How do we get there to help them turn around from a level of intensity that is going in the wrong direction?
So Nick, let me restate my. So regional collaboration, First Peoples, Native Americans as models for that question.
Yeah. So I mean, the rationale we often talk about for regional collaboration on these issues is that ecological processes and issues transcend political boundaries. So we need to be working together across political boundaries, taking cooperative approaches. I would say that involving indigenous nations, indigenous groups in those regional collaboratives both complicates the effort of collaboration. It makes it harder oftentimes, and it's worth it. And so I'll kind of explain both. So it makes it more challenging oftentimes because there's sort of in general, there's often a lack of recognition of where indigenous groups fit into those conversations. And it's by and large, and this varies where in the world you're talking about, but in this region, in the region that's focus of this conference, indigenous nations fit in as governmental entities. So they fit in as counterparts to state and federal agency representatives, not as stakeholder groups. And it's oftentimes difficult just to get to the point where everybody sort of agrees that that's where we're starting. So that's challenging. It's also challenging because oftentimes indigenous groups are brought in late, and they feel like they're brought in sort of in like a token way, or they're brought into an existing framework, and so they have to fit their perspectives and their priorities into existing frameworks. So backing up, if we can get groups involved early and we can have them help shape the collaborative frameworks, can be very powerful. And one of the reasons that I provide is that talking about groups of people that have had time in particular geographic places, interacting with the places and the natural systems that we're talking about, interacting with them in dynamic ways for thousands of years. And it's easy to think that, contemporary indigenous groups, like their knowledge systems are so, they're basically all have been disrupted by colonialism, and there's just not, there's just bits and pieces there. How useful can it really be? But you'd be surprised how much people bring to the table in terms of big picture, sort of systems level understandings of what's going on, and oftentimes in the sense of sort of relationality, like how people and societies are dynamically linked with so-called natural systems. And just to give like a quick example, indigenous groups are really at the forefront of river restoration efforts around the world. And we see sort of like restoration ecology in sort of riverine systems as having gone through this evolution to where now we recognize, again, from like sort of like a conservation and restoration standpoint, or Western ecology, we recognize rivers as dynamic living systems, okay? Indigenous partners in restoration efforts have recognized that forever and never lost sight of that rivers are dynamic living systems, but they're even in a different place, and maybe it's a step ahead. Maybe it's not a place that the whole community needs to go to, but maybe it is. And the different place is that seeing rivers as dynamic living systems, okay, but as also as like individuals, as living beings that people are born of and are related to. And so we see in places like New Zealand where there's now legal rights afforded to rivers, okay, and that's a unique approach. It's a unique thing, but it's a part of their sort of their restoration strategy, and really it is their restoration work in New Zealand and other places where indigenous groups are heavily involved. The restoration is part and parcel of reconnecting people with water, reconnecting people with human systems, and really seeing how that works, as opposed to just, it is a sort of a systems approach, but not separating and saying, okay, how do we understand these natural systems and how they work and how they function and the data associated with them, but really embedding societies in that.
Great, thank you so much. I think we need to move to the question and answer period now. Looking over at Tom there. You were okay? Okay, so please, questions from the audience. Deborah. You didn't think I'd call on you. Okay, well, for Deborah Kramer, renowned author and Environmental Solutions Initiative, visiting scholar. Anyone, questions?
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. I'm Sarah Jackson. I'm an energy policy manager for the Nature Conservancy in the Northeast. And so most of my work actually relates to more of what happened yesterday, more of what we talked about yesterday. Most of my organization's work fits in really well with the panel right now on natural climate solutions. And I don't have a question, so I'm going to be really quick, because I'm just going to say that our organization recently put out a publication, a study in the proceedings for the, why am I forgetting the name?
National Academy of Sciences.
Thank you. On the importance of natural climate solutions that essentially say that we could achieve through cost-effective natural climate solutions up to 37% of the carbon emissions reductions we need to keep our warming below 2 degrees. And so I think that just helps emphasize how important this is. And so I really thank you for the panel, and I thank the organizers for putting it together.
And maybe, can I go further? Because that 37% is a great deal larger than previous estimates.
Then it was, yes.
And so that number is very enticing. The way to get to that number is extraordinarily complex, because we're talking about not only the avoiding land conversion, but also afforesting, and lots of other strategies. So there's a complexity there, but I still want to emphasize, and I think the PNAS paper made this point, that in terms of expense, so ton of carbon avoided or captured, still, and scalable, still by far the most enticing strategy. And for example, if you compare it to bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, with carbon capture and storage, which is not anywhere really now. And good luck scaling that up. So just wanted to lay that.
Yeah, and it makes my job easier since I want to reduce emissions. Makes that piece smaller.
There was another question over here.
Hi, I'm Laura Hesse-Fisher. I'm with the Center for Collective Intelligence here at MIT. Thanks again also for this panel. Someone told me once that we need to listen to indigenous communities because they know how to work in systems. And I thought that was a very wise way of looking at the value that they can bring to the way that we think. And so I was really intrigued by your suggestions on how to engage indigenous communities in tackling this issue. But what I don't know about is, are there successful ways that that's happened? Can you tell any stories about where people were consulted early in the process and maybe it did shift people's minds and maybe new solutions were created that wouldn't have happened otherwise? Or is this, I mean, we're still struggling with this in the United States and trying to recognize people who are here in this land long before me and my European heritage was. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about maybe some case stories or things that you see are in the works that are making that happen.
Yeah, so just to give the big picture, the success stories are few and far between. So I think oftentimes, like people in this room might think about, indigenous groups working with like big green NGOs or working with federal state partners on the types of issues that we're discussing. Like it's just a natural and it's probably happening, but oftentimes that doesn't work out. Folks don't get together, or they get together and then they break up. But there are good success stories. And the good thing is, in terms of responding to your question, that those success stories are well studied because they are kind of few and far between. So if you sort of like dig into the literature, you find them. What you don't find are the thousands of examples of things just not working out. And so it's important to think about so both, like why doesn't it work out so often, and when it does, what's behind that. Some good examples include work in, so like in my home state of Michigan, there's a tribe that the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians that's been involved, working very closely with the state of Michigan, multiple departments in the state of Michigan, working with big conservation organizations and working with federal agencies to fund, design, implement a river restoration strategy where they're removing dams on sort of a medium scale river by Michigan standards, but it's the largest river restoration project in the state's history. They're also sort of, as a part of the process, renaming the river. So it's the name that people have known it by for a couple hundred years. It's named after a timber baron that made a lot of money off of cutting and selling trees and then leaving quickly and wasn't in the area for very long. So they're going back to an older name, an indigenous name, and that's an important political process. And it's mostly a feel-good story. I mean, there's definitely some resistance, but it's mostly at the individual landowner level. Whenever you talk about removing dams, there's consequences in terms of flood regimes, and so there has been some pushback, but mostly it's been a really good example of state government, federal government, large and small NGOs, and a tribe working together to get something done that all the partners, when they tell their story about this, they call it a success. And they say, we couldn't have done it without each other. The tribe couldn't have done it alone, and the other groups couldn't have done it without the tribe. There's a film that came out about that. So if you look up, the old name of the river is the Boardman River, and the new name that they're going to likely change it to is the Ottawa. So if you kind of search on that, you'll find a film on Vimeo that sort of describes that. Another really good example, it's a very similar story, and it's in this region, is in the Penobscot River system. And so the Penobscot tribe has worked similarly, again, with small and large NGOs, with state government, federal government, to work on restoring salmon habitat on the Penobscot River. Another good story. And I know those are two river examples, but it's just what I've been studying recently. Yeah.
Kurt? Can we get Kurt on the microphone?
Hi, I'm Kurt Newton, work with MIT Climate X, and I'd like to bring my Midwestern farming perspective to bear here. Certainly my family and the farmers that I've gotten to know are extremely responsive to incentives and market conditions. And a lot of the practices, restorative agriculture and the like, look good on kind of a pilot program scale, but they run up against, for instance, the lack of, say, markets to sell oats, which you'd like to feed into your rotation, for instance, or other kinds of government programs. Reflecting on, say, the blue carbon pricing for nature sort of situation, but more broadly, what thoughts does the panel have about ways to more effectively bring the market forces into the food system to pull us in the right direction?
Yeah, that's the current crux of the matter of really how can the food system shift. I mean, I've participated. I am encouraged by branded production systems that will engage consumers and that will basically sponsor a less intensive form of agriculture. And I worked for quite a number of years focusing on the development of the organic standards in Canada and the organic label, primarily for international markets. It's a very export-driven organic sector in Canada. But much of the research focus was what's the value purchase there on behalf of the consumers? What's the co-benefits? What's the ecosystem services of a less productive agricultural system, inherently less productive? And we mapped it and documented that across dairy and grain and potato production organic systems in Canada, which had been in existence for 30 years or more. And, so what's the trade-off? That 25% less production, that 30% less production, in return, what are you getting? And so we were able to track, and it wasn't on all cases. So yes, lower nutrient loading, yes, better soil health, yes, better retention of soil active carbon and stored carbon, but not necessarily more efficiency in some other areas as well. So that I think that's part of the solution is other programs that somehow, and there's an enormous number of proliferation of brands developing in that regard, regenerative agriculture, various labels, conservation agriculture, and various sectors within agriculture that are trying to move forward in that regard, that would engage the public. In terms of carbon credits, and carbon offsets, that's much more difficult. And it's really based on a practice change. So if I return to the rangeland producers, who are the ultimate conservative producers by maintaining these extensive landscapes with great biodiversity, lots of pollinators, lots of vegetation diversity, lots of habitat for wildlife, and lots of soil carbon, but they're not changing their practice significantly enough to change the total carbon, so they're left out of the carbon offset market. Whereas it's ironically, the farms that have lost historically 30 or 40 or 50%, gone into annual cropping, and now are practicing no-till and that are able to cash in to some degree. So there's tremendous inconsistencies in that opportunity for much of agriculture, but it's still going to be an important player. In Eastern Canada, in our region, it's not obvious because you're often dealing with rotation systems, more complex farming systems than in Western semi-arid regions, that it's less obvious how they can participate in carbon offset, even at potentially attractive prices of $50 a ton, where we're heading in Canada. Carbon taxes is another vehicle, and the agricultural community, I've been at any number of presentations at the agricultural standing committees of both the Senate and the House of Commons in Canada. They've invited all stakeholders as to whether carbon tax would be a useful vehicle to shift agriculture as well. And there's a tremendous nervousness and pushback from agriculture around carbon tax. And partly because it may be misplaced. It may not actually get us where we want to go in agriculture. I'm not sure that answered that.
So Mike, please go ahead. But also, let's ease into, I think we have to ease into final comments from the panel, if you have any.
Sure, I'd like to respond to this notion that people respond to incentives in the forest context. And I want to clarify, if I wasn't earlier clear enough, that when I say there's this power in forests, sure, it includes traditional approaches to protecting forests, setting them aside, conservation easements, et cetera, right? But another really important piece of this, and it's hard to incentivize necessarily for everyone to do that. Another way of keeping forests is this idea that we're going to save forests by cutting some trees. Not willy-nilly, but we're going to do it closely and carefully and intelligently based, again, on evolving principles of enhancing complexity and resilience in forest systems through forest management. We know more and more about this, and it's very exciting, and none of it matters if there's no marketplace into which people can sell forest products. Very quickly, in the Northeast, the forest products economy is in crisis, largely owing to many global forces, particularly where low-grade trees. It's a hard thing for me to say because I love all trees, but when we say low-grade trees, we mean the ones that don't make the grade for high-value forest products like veneer and craftsmanship and lumber products, but instead pulp for paper making, which has moved out of the region in a big way, and a real cascade of effects back through the region, particularly in Vermont. So whereas the low-grade trees, when we manage forests, it's sort of like a garden, we sell the weeds. The low-grade trees have traditionally been exported to Maine, particularly from Vermont, to be turned into paper. That has been shut off. And so there's no longer this sort of bottom-level subsidy for the other forest management that goes on. So we're looking for new ways to replace that collapse in that market demand, and we see real benefit and possibility through wood energy, particularly wood heat, and advanced, what we call modern wood heating, clean burning, efficient use of the feedstock locally. So we are seeing this as a way to meet people where they are. There's tremendous disincentive for land ownership. There's all these pressures to convert forest to non-forest. If we can help rebuild a marketplace and a local economy based on wood, we believe, we're very sanguine that will be a strong way to keep forests forest. So when you consider that it still is, New England, regionally, a kind of a cold place much of the year, 85% of all heating oil used in this country is burned right here in New England, 85%. In Vermont, long tradition of heating with wood. We're a national leader. More than a third of Vermont school children go to schools heated with wood. Almost 30% of college and university students in Vermont now go to schools heated by wood, locally produced according to best practices. And yet it's 15% of our energy, of our thermal demand. It's pathetic. So we have a goal of doubling that to 30% of our heating needs through local wood in these clean burning, efficient approaches. And seeing that as a way to meet people where they are and providing an incentive to keep forests forest through an economic incentive that actually matters to people, especially when they start to realize that it is completely consistent with these other benefits of clean water, outdoor recreation, fall foliage. We're pretty good at that. So thinking about rebuilding our energy economy in support of a forest economy, in support of forest health for climate resilience and human health, as an exciting way to provide incentives to keep forests forest.
Any final comments from the?
If I might just pick up on his question about the blue carbon pricing and connect the dots really quickly. So one of the things that we learned through our stakeholder engagement process is that people were just as interested in the market side as they were with what we call the non-market benefits of this whole process. So in fact, and as we've been involved in that whole effort for 8 years now, what has come full circle is that I think people respond to just the understanding that these natural places are providing a huge benefit in a much more impactful way than they even do to the market forces. I don't have a relationship with the farming community to speak about that, but talking about from stakeholders looking at coastal wetlands and what they provide is that the understanding the non-market benefits, those ecosystem services that these systems provide, and that if we continue to protect restore these places, we're getting both the carbon value as well as we're getting the value for water protection, water quality, coastal protection and all of that. So that alone you can get a lot of mileage out of advancing people's understanding of what these places are doing naturally. On the market side, as we're exploring, we're on the cusp of trying to work on bringing those pieces together that would lay the groundwork for coastal wetlands to be considered in carbon markets, but we're still in a voluntary carbon market world. We're still trying to explore all the different pieces, getting the protocols in place. That's been done, a methodology by which you can actually factor these systems in, and then now working on feasibility studies to figure out what would it take to do that. So we're not quite there yet with getting all the pieces in place to have the first blue carbon wetland project go off, but we're very close to that. And I would say that stakeholders are pretty excited about that, but you have to manage the expectations of how much money you can get from the carbon market. That's one thing. We've had to walk that line of being able to say, these systems do that function, we could possibly capitalize on that for financing and use that, invest that back in nature, invest that back in restoring these systems so that they can do the functions they do naturally, but also not build expectations too high where they think that a carbon market might be able to give enough resources to pay for a whole restoration project, because then they get deflated and they might walk away. So I think we want to, what our stakeholders have told us is actually to lead with the non-market ecosystem benefits. That alone is a big sell, and then have the market side kind of follow as we put the pieces together with that. So I think I will stop there so that Nick has time to comment.
Is it time? Yeah, of course.
So I just wanted to quickly bring up one thing that, is that good?
Yes, of course.
One thing that hadn't come up yet in our conversation that it's, I think, an important consideration. When we're talking about nature-based approaches to climate change resilience and adaptation, and when we're talking about land conservation and biodiversity conservation, which are, there's overlap in those two topics. When we're talking about those two topics, it's really important to be thinking, front end, thinking in the fronts of our minds about equity issues. So by equity issues, I mean communities that have less political power to influence the decision making around those strategies. Make sure that we're thinking about with them. We're thinking about potential direct and indirect consequences for those communities of these actions. And the best way to think that through is with communities that are, that are less empowered politically and maybe not at the table. So getting them to the table and thinking those things on the front end. And indigenous peoples are part of that. And I'd say it's not solely an indigenous issue. On the indigenous side of things, it's really also thinking about, not just from an environmental justice standpoint, but also thinking about the rights of indigenous peoples. The rights that indigenous people have to territories, which is a complex and multi-layered thing that really needs to be, again, similarly thought through on the front end in direct partnership with those groups. And that's really critical in these nature-based approaches, which oftentimes, not entirely, but a lot of times it has to do with sort of land conservation and limiting certain land use practices in certain areas. We have a global history of conserving lands and setting aside and restricting land use practices within indigenous territories without consulting indigenous peoples, and sometimes moving indigenous peoples out of their territories to achieve our well-intentioned goals. And a part of that process also has to do with data collection projects. We oftentimes think of data as apolitical, but data are very political. The assumptions that underlie data collection projects or data tools, the assumptions that underlie them make the whole process political. And so we can't take it for granted that anybody who might contribute to those projects or might be affected by them has the same politics or has the same assumptions or would be affected by the data in the same ways, or would want to share them in the same ways. I think that the idea of open access data is really wonderful in a lot of contexts, but in some contexts, it can also be leaving out people who say, you want data about us, but you're going to create data about us. You want us to share data. that maybe we don't, we're concerned that it's not going to be used in a way that meets our interests. And so those types of considerations are really important.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much. So at the end of many panels, often there's a question, I'm going to anticipate that, what can we do as individuals with these sets of topics? So I have two thoughts, and I'll end the panel with these two thoughts. For 2018, New Year's just about upon us. The first is go plant a tree. Or, you can do that, and it matters. Or go plant 10 trees in 2018. And the second returns us to the beginning, since this is the final summit, returns us to the beginning of the summit, final panel of the summit. The beginning of the summit also started with the recommendation, go vote in 2018. The more interested and the more you value the environment, climate change, but just the environment, local, the more you appreciate nature, the more you call yourself an environmentalist, the less likely you're going to vote. That's established in this country. That's the reality here in the United States. So take that on as well. So 2018 is a key year. We hope you've enjoyed this panel, and please join me in thanking all of the panelists.